Happy World Water Day, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Kestrel Jenkins, and I host and produce the Conscious Chatter podcast. I'm so excited to be here today to chat with all these amazing folks. Just to preface, we can't talk about water without talking about microfibers, the tiny polluters that shed from our wardrobe and end up in our waterways. Microfibers shed from our clothes, and they've been found in the water we drink, in the air we breathe, even in our bodies. So it's a bit overwhelming, but fortunately, solutions do exist. And we're really going to dive into that extensively, looking at science and solutions today. So with us today, we have Dr. Lisa Erdle, the Director of Science and Innovation at the Gyres Institute. We have Dr. Emmy Uchida, Professor in Environmental and Natural Resources and Economics at the University of Rhode Island. Emily Axten, the Marketing and Communications Director at XEROS. And Dr. Shreyas Patankar, Research Scientist at OceanWise. So first of all, thank you all for taking the time to join us today to dive into this.
Thanks.
Yeah, well, we're going to get into, unraveling this issue and exploring innovation and solutions, and really want to give you actionable steps that you can take with you and put into practice in your own lives. We're going to leave space at the end for Q&A, so just a heads up to try to hold your questions till the end, and we'll get to as many of those as possible then. So let's dive in. Nowadays, I would imagine that because of the work of organizations like OceanWise and Gyres and others around the world, most people are aware of, microplastics. It's something that many of us have heard about today now. But today we are specifically honing in on microfibers. I think it's really important to recognize that, over 60% of our clothes today are made from synthetic materials. So that's a lot of plastic pollution shedding from our clothes. I mentioned earlier about how microfibers, are found in the water we drink. They've been found in our bodies. They've been found in the air that we breathe. But how do they actually arrive there? Like, how do they actually get there? So I'm wondering if one of you, to get us started, can kind of help contextualize the issue a bit and frame up, more on where these fibers are coming from and how they are arriving around us in our environment.
I could kick things off, and I'm sure everyone has lots to contribute. But you're right. We've been aware of microplastics for many years. Even still to this day, when people think about plastic, they don't necessarily think about textile fibers, but they're so common in many environments that we look at around the world. They're the most common type of microplastic and other anthropogenic pollution. But we haven't known about the issue for very long. The first research paper was in the early 2000s that found microfibers, and it's really, as our science has improved and we're starting to measure smaller and smaller particles, microfibers started coming up as some of the most common particle types. And a study by Mark Brown in 2011 that was on a seashore in the UK, right by sewage outfall, was finding microfibers that matched the same types of plastics that we have in our clothing, like nylon and polyester, and made the connection. These fibers that we're finding in the environment are likely coming from the clothing that we wash. And we've since done experiments to understand the factors that impact shedding, which materials shed more. OceanWise has led a lot of important research in that space. And we understand that washing our clothing is a major source of microfiber pollution to the environment. It's not the only source, but it's one that we know quite well and things that we already have solutions for.
Mm-hmm. Another thing that I feel like I've learned from you, Lisa, is the way that microfibers can travel such extensive distances. I guess, can you talk about that, or anyone else who has insight on that, just so we understand like how much these can travel and what that might mean?
Yeah, I think many people are aware of microfibers floating around as dust. Like on a bright sunny day, if you have sun coming through your window, it's sunny even in the UK right now, Emily, maybe you see dust floating around. But these brightly colored flecks of dust are often microfibers, and they're so lightweight, they can travel far distances. It's likely how these fibers are getting into remote environments like Mount Everest and the East Sierras in North America and the Arctic and the Antarctic, because they're so small and so lightweight. We're talking about tiny, tiny little fibers that can float quite far.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. So we understand a bit of the information as far as like how they're arriving from our clothes out into the environment. Um, but why is it such a pressing issue? I think a lot of times people are, brushing things off nowadays. There's so many things to worry about, right? And so why is this something that we really need to be concerned about for the environmental issue, for, our own personal health? I was wondering if, Shreyas, I was wondering if you might want to jump in based on your kind of like advocacy meets science work.
Yeah, I mean, my the way I would answer this is kind of building on what Lisa just said, which is the work the research that we did in the Arctic and found microfibers in the Arctic, which is, it's one thing to see as a scientist, see research papers and data and see the analysis, but actually looking at, I wasn't on the expedition, but actually looking at the fibers and photographs of fibers that really shouldn't be in a place where they shouldn't be. It moved me personally and really made me feel about like, yeah, this isn't right. There's something off here. But to answer your question, why should we care? I think to me that's reason enough. Like there's something clearly off here. But also there's quite a bit of research now on like these really have made it, these microfibers have made it everywhere. It's not just water, it's not just oceans. We have found them in intestines of beluga whales. We are looking at microfibers in mussels and various key marine organisms. And my lab has been doing a little bit of work on, just because we get this question so often, like giving specific answers on what they're doing to organisms. Like, can we say on the biological metabolism level, what impact microfibers have on specific sea creatures?
I guess just to build on that as well, I think was it last week or the week before? I'm sure some of us will have seen that there was a report that came out from a study on people that were having heart attacks and strokes. And we were seeing that actually where there was a prevalence of microplastics and microfibers in their bodies, there was a higher risk of this health incidents of strokes, heart attacks, and even death within sort of 3 years, I think it was, if I'm citing it right. And I think so what's really interesting, I think, from sort of what Shreyas and Lisa are saying as well, is that because they're so small, actually how they can travel through the environment, how they can travel through organisms, how they can travel through people, and how we deal with that and how many there are, and they're building all the time. I think it's a really concerning thing because we don't know enough yet, but we are seeing as time progresses all the time and the science improves all the time, this building information, which is that they look to be linked to, brain things, heart things, so fundamental human health is being impacted, and there's no way of stopping them getting into your body because they're in the environment and we're consuming them as part of just living.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Does anyone have any other thoughts they want to make sure that we think about when we are framing up like why this really matters?
I would just say one more thing, that the chemical cocktail of microfibers might be different compared to other microplastics. So we know that microplastics are incredibly diverse. There are hundreds of polymers. A report came out last week that linked around 16,000 chemical additives to plastic. But what we have with microfibers, because textiles are applied with various finishes and treatments and dyes that are unique compared to other plastics, the effects from these fibers might be different. They're also a very unique shape. A lot of microplastics in the environment are fragments, or we see spheres from microbeads, but this long sort of fiber is a different shape. And especially when it has really sharp edges, it's not something that is commonly encountered by wildlife in nature or really by us naturally. So, we see that for some lab experiments that I've done, feeding different aquatic species with microfibers and other diets without, some of these animals are ingesting really, really long microfibers. They're almost slurping them up like spaghetti, and then they get all tangled up and they end up in the gut. So they can have these physical effects. But what's really concerning to me is these chemical effects. And it's because we have these very complex chemical cocktails that are applied to textiles, especially our clothing. And we don't understand the full impacts of that unique chemical cocktail and what it does to the environment.
Mm-hmm.
I'll just add one quick point to what Lisa just said, which is we just published a study where we did a very comparative analysis of what zooplankton, which are these tiny like shrimp-like creatures in the Pacific Ocean, we found that they have trouble distinguishing between microfibers and food. So like when kind of given the choice or when exposed to these microfibers, they continue their feeding behavior and consume microfibers instead of their food. And they like, to the extent they can think, they think they're full, but they're not. Like clearly these microfibers aren't nutritious. So that was like a very noticeable effect, and we were quite surprised by it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Another thing I think that kind of builds off of that chemical cocktail concept is this reality that, I think we often put microplastics and microfibers, like we automatically assume that they're all plastic. And something that I learned a lot, again, I learned from Lisa in a podcast we did was, microfibers can be a natural fiber derived as well. And so I think in the fashion space, we're often saying, oh, well, natural fibers are the better option, which I think they can be in certain capacities. But then if they are getting that chemical cocktail added to them with the dyes and finishes, et cetera, there's a lot of unknowns when it comes to that. So I guess maybe let's think about that toxicity a little bit. And I'm curious, based on all of your work, what is something that you've found? What should we be concerned about when we think of also natural fibers becoming microfibers and kind of integrating with our environment?
Well, Emily, you've seen that the magnitude can be so different, right? And Shreyas as well, that natural fibers can shed a lot.
Absolutely. And I guess, and I have to apologize because I am not a scientist at all, and I'm still learning all the time from our science team. But I remember Dr. Paul Servin, our scientist at XEROS, talking to me about actually as well that they can behave, cellulosic fibers can actually behave in the environment almost as a magnet for other things. So not only do they take those chemicals that might be on them, and also let's not forget to add, like in terms of, you think of cellulosic fibers as degrading, they're natural. So they'll go out into the environment and they'll biodegrade and they won't be there. But actually there was a really interesting study that was done in the UK in a riverbed adjacent to a very, very old cotton mill that used to be there. It's no longer there. And they were looking right down into the kind of silts in the riverbed, and they were finding they're still doing some forensic dating on those materials that they found, but they were finding fibers really low down from years and years ago, natural fibers, pre sort of the use of polyester and these things. And so they not only do they go into the environment, they stay in the environment because what's happened is they're completely altered by the chemicals that have been added to dye them, to finish them, as Lisa was saying. And then what they do is they can then attract things like pathogens, other stuff. And so they actually almost behave, you almost can think about them as a carrier of things. And so they're then taking that and carrying those other things through. And I think that's where, we see particularly this narrative that was around for quite some time on this idea that, and you see it very much still in the fashion industry. I mean, that's my background and where I come from. And, you see a lot of kind of positive association with, buy this organic cotton t-shirt, it's absolutely fine. It's natural, it's organic, but actually it's not, because it's been through a bleaching process, a dyeing process. It's not natural in any way. The actual chemical makeup of those strands of material are entirely different to how they started out, and nature can no longer break them down.
Mm-hmm. Or it does eventually break down. It just takes really long timeframes and really depends on the environment. But when you have those chemicals, it can really slow it. You have a finish, you have a dye. I've learned about some of the textile processes, and cotton can be up to 1/3 synthetic chemicals by weight. And a lot of those synthetic chemicals can slow degradation processes. They can impact toxicity. And we have this blurry line between what's natural and then what is synthetic. Machine washable wool can be coated in a thin layer of polyurethane, so you can toss it in the washing machine. So that's a thin layer of plastic, but it's on a natural material. But I don't think we often think about that added component and what that does and what level of modification kind of bumps it into the category of plastic.
And it's so tricky, isn't it? Because some of that's about actually trying to make something last longer. So you see things like, I don't know, white t-shirts that have got, some kind of stay white, piece on them. And so you kind of think, okay, well then there's positivity around something that perhaps might be used for longer, but we're obviously not seeing that behavior with consumers, are we? We're seeing this change of behavior with how people consume and keep their clothes. And so actually those benefits that might have once been there around keeping something durable isn't necessarily positive anymore if people aren't going to behave in that way and keep it durable themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. It makes me think about, I don't know if anyone's seen, a pair of jeans nowadays usually has stretch in it, and you put it into the compost bin, and then they let it compost because you're thinking it's cotton, it's going to compost, but then like you pull it out and it's all these little tiny striations of elastane from the spandex in the jeans, and that's still there. It's not breaking down. I feel like a really big question that comes up with microfibers, and I know it's one that you're all kind of asking in different ways as well, is do certain fibers shed more than others? So Shreyas, I know you've done some research on like comparative shedding rates. So can you talk a little bit about what you've discovered so far, or what any of others have uncovered on this?
Yeah, we did do a study, and I think when we started doing the study and when people ask us about it, the expectation is, we have an answer that, put ingredient X in your process and that'll fix shedding. And unfortunately, that's not what we found. It was quite a comprehensive study. That this was like, 30 something different fabric categories. We tried to do a permutation of as many different parameters in the fabric design as we can, and do a statistical analysis. And the short, 30,000 foot version of it is it's in the wash. No pun intended. It's there's some things that stand out very clearly, and maybe our audience will like figure out why. So for example, nylon fabrics were found to be significantly lower shedding than anything else. Whereas on the flip side, cotton and also polyester jerseys specifically, and also to some extent cotton jerseys were, fleeces were some of the highest shedding, which it is very statistically significant, but it kind of raises a question is how useful this information is, because nylon fabrics are kind of designed to be outdoor wear, like durable fabric. So it's maybe less surprising that they shed less. It's the same deal with, we also looked at treatments and found that so-called mechanical treatment, which includes things like brushing and napping, that tends to lead to higher microfiber shedding. Now you can say that, we should just stop doing that, but then the thing that gets very complicated is part of the reason we buy fleeces and jerseys and sweaters is because, all of us like the warm fuzzy feeling that these fabrics give us. We wouldn't want to necessarily wear a raincoat as a sweater, right? So it's trying to find this balance between the qualities that make these fabrics desirable also lead to microfiber shedding. So there's there's some really, really interesting innovation going on in this space with like apparel brands trying to engineer fabrics that kind of strike the middle ground of still feeling warm and fuzzy, but not shedding as much. But it is like it's very, very tricky engineering, as you can imagine.
Yeah, there's some exciting innovations though. Houdini won the Conservation X Microfiber Challenge several years ago, and they made a fleece, but instead of all of those loose fibers being exposed on a fleece that makes it fuzzy, those fibers were contained in little pockets. So you still kind of get like the warmth and the technical components of it without the microfiber shedding. So it's really interesting to see brands come on and tackle this challenge. I'd be interested, Emmy, to get your take on, like, is it the brand's responsibility? Should consumers be reading labels and trying to disentangle, you know, do knits shed more than wovens? What if fleece and finished edges have to do with it? Where, you know, who bears some of this responsibility?
Yeah, right. I mean, when we think about this problem of microfiber pollution, you know, why is it so difficult to solve, right? It's fundamentally what economists would call a negative externality problem, where I wear synthetic fiber, I wash clothes made from synthetic materials, microfiber goes down the drain, it potentially impacts marine life, right? It's impacts the ecosystem beyond me, right? It's you know, my behavior impacts other things, not myself. Eventually, you know, it might come back to me through drinking water, but basically it's an externality problem, right? So I don't have the full incentive to correct for the problem. The problem with so comparing to other kinds of water pollution or air pollution problems, which are also negative externality problems, right? In this case, we have many, many polluters. All of us are polluting to the extent that we don't treat any of these microfibers, right? So, you know, who should you know, who should be responsible for this is more of an in part ethical question, but the way economists view this is what is the most cost-effective solution, right? And so there are many ways to manage these kinds of pollutions in general. And, you know, first thing we would think about is regulation, right? So make it mandatory for manufacturers to abate pollution by installing these microfiber filters built in automatically in the washing machines, right? So making it mandatory. So that would be a regulatory approach. You know, because there are so many polluters that leads to microfiber pollution, I think regulatory approach makes a lot of sense. I think I haven't seen a cost benefit analysis. I think there needs to be some kind of a, you know, cost benefit analysis, as well as even just looking at different kinds of solutions that you're all talking about, and looking at, you know, the changes in marginal cost of abatement. You know, that's a kind of the information that regulators would want to see. But you know, and I think it makes a lot of sense to go through that kind of regulation. Maybe, you know, at least starting from commercial grade washing machines, you know, that probably does much larger volumes than a typical household, and make those commercial grade washing machines mandatory to install these filters. I think that's a kind of a sensible thing to do. But the problem with any regulation is that it takes a lot of time. It takes a long time to create such a regulation in the US at the federal level. Maybe some states have more advantages. Maybe there's they have voters who prefer a more sustainable oriented society, and so they might pass laws that make these mandates in some states more likely than others. Another issue about the regulation is that even if there is a law that makes it mandatory for manufacturers to do that, right, it's going to take a long time before all of our washing machines in the US or elsewhere gets converted to one with microfiber filter, right? So it's a gradual process, even if we can get this mandatory, right? If I think about washing machines that we used, maybe typically we might replace it every 10 years, 15 years, maybe 20 years for some people, right? So it's going to take a long time for this to really kick in. So I think the regulations need to be coupled with other kinds of ways to change behavior. And so I think a complementary approach would be very sensible.
Yeah, especially since we have our washing machines for such a long time, and you don't want to create incentives for people to just replace a piece of equipment that has a lot of energy and raw materials that go into it, to have that filter built in. But we know that filtration can capture 90% or more of microfibers in a single load of laundry. And when you consider that just a household washing machine can shed between hundreds of thousands to millions of microfibers in a single load, commercial washing machines are even bigger, so that's an even higher magnitude of shedding. It's a lot, and there are filtration solutions, and to have it just be easy and cost effective and built in automatically to machines makes sense to me.
Mm-hmm. I love that you just kind of like went to solutions, and I didn't even have to, like ask for those ideas, because I think that's kind of, that's where a lot of us are today. Like, we understand the issue and we just want to figure out what we can do and how we can get engaged. So I love that you're kind of, building on this filtration element. I was also curious about, based on those shed rates that are starting to become a little bit more clear, or a little more information is becoming available in the science lens, for the shed rates, like, are there preferred fibers at all? Are there preferred fabric constructions, textile constructions? Is there anything out there that brands can kind of like start with when they're trying to reduce the shed rate of the materials they're using?
I can start, and I think others will have a lot more to say about this, but we are kind of starting to at least get, numbers on the high end and low end, and like just get a sense of what's the worst of the worst and what's good. So in our lab, we kind of use this metric of milligrams per kilogram of shedding of fibers that you can have, and this you can translate it to like percentage of, like, this is 0.01% of fibers being lost per wash. I believe it works out to anything around 0.01% is okay. If you're getting to 0.1%, that's starting to be really bad. And there are like some fabrics that do that. So that starts to get bad. And what causes this variation is kind of a very complicated question. And it gets back to something I said earlier about some material properties, like nylon versus others, make a difference. But also mechanical treatment, like making things fuzzy, makes a difference. One other piece that is maybe a slight tangent, but something we did in addition to things like adding filters is, can you do some engineering in terms of how washing machines themselves work? Like, there's like the spinning and agitation and pumping that happens inside a washing machine. Is there some clever engineering that you can do there that reduces the chance of these fibers, like the fabrics washing against each other and shedding more? And we have some evidence that, like, just having those machines be a little more careful about in terms of how they're moving helps, and can have a like 50-70% reduction in shedding rates. But I'm sure Emily and Lisa for sure have more to add here.
I can definitely talk to that a bit, because the technology that we have actually was born from what Shreyas is talking about. So when XEROS first was sort of incorporated as a company, it came from the University of Leeds, and they had a professor there that was studying textiles and how you deploy chemistry into textiles and what you do with them. And he invented something we call an XORB, which is a little polymer bead. They're very, very small, about the size of a garden pea. And they're within the drum of a washing machine. They're kept at the back and they're released into the wash. And what they enabled was a lot of interesting things. They enabled sort of a reduction of water and a reduction of chemistry. But actually what happened is that this technology has been around for a little while. And when microfibers sort of became a bit more prevalent and we understood that there was issues with microplastics, the team at XEROS were really concerned that we were trying to introduce a technology that was about sustainability and doing things really well, but they were a polymer, they were a nylon, these beads. So there was real concern that they may be contributing to microplastics in the environment. So we did a load of studies and a load of work. And what we found is that actually when you washed in a normal load, and then you did that same load, but you used these XOrbs, because of the interaction between the garments. So if you imagine in a washing machine, your garments are like rubbing together and those fibers are really kind of agitating each other. When we added in these nylon beads, what was happening is the fibers were rolling over them much, much more gently. And actually what we saw with that was that when you use XOrbs, there was a reduction of 50% on that microfiber shedding because of the gentleness. We see a load of amazing benefits around the fabric care and all of the other stuff that comes with that. What then happened is the team sort of said, well, that's great. Okay, we've now understood that we're not contributing to the problem. We are making it better, but we're still seeing 50% of these fibers going out into the environment. And that was when they started the technology development for filtration, because it was sort of that thought that actually 50% is still much too many. And we're now at a place where we're stopping over 90% going out. But exactly as you're saying, Shreyas, that agitation in the water because of how the materials are, when they're wet. I mean, we see it when they're dry, it's all of that that's causing them to shed. I mean, you'll notice on some of your garments, even as you're walking around, like Lisa said, in the sunlight, you will be able to see tiny little fibers coming off as you're just walking and rubbing those materials together.
That's why CSI and crime shows have used fiber ID for so long, that they're shedding off of our clothing when we're wearing them, when we're washing them. A good friend, Crystal Moody Wood, says that putting our clothing through washing and drying is like putting our clothes through warfare. It's really hard on our clothing, all of that mechanical abrasion when you have water and you have materials rubbing against each other, or air and that friction. But there are things, like we know that woven materials shed fewer microfibers than knits. It's like about the tightness of the weave too. So there are these things that textile manufacturers and brands can do to reduce that shedding rate. And then when we're washing them, there are things that reduce that friction, and even in a load of laundry, like you were saying, Emily, like to create those beads and reduce the amount of rubbing. We also see from the research that full loads of laundry tend to shed fewer microfibers than less garments in a load. There's just less mechanical abrasion. You can still get your clothes clean. It just isn't the same level of high intensity rubbing, or if you have a intense cycle on your washing machine that tends to hot, all these things, whatever is causing the most rubbing and heat and damage is often leading to breaking up of the textiles and shedding more microfibers.
I think what's so tricky for consumers, I mean, I think the thing you were asking as well, Kestrel, was around, the responsibility. I think what's really challenging for consumers is if you think about like your garments, like lots of people will get something and maybe they've got like a really itchy, scratchy label in their garment. So they'll like cut that out, and they'll, when you wash things, you're kind of looking at it and thinking, oh, well, I'm just going to put these garments together because, they're, light colors or dark colors. I don't think the level of education that's expected or maybe expected for a consumer to think about when they're buying something, how much it might shed when I'm washing it, how to care for it. As Shreyas said, we're very tactile people. We want to wear things because they feel a certain way. And, putting that onto consumers, I think is really challenging. And to my mind, inappropriate. Actually, it needs to start at the other end. I think the brands absolutely have a responsibility. We know there's a lot of challenges there. And for me, it's sort of like, that piece around working together and working in collaboration. We hear narratives sometimes around, well, the brands need to take responsibility. Laundry, maybe says, well, we're not causing that. But for me, it's like, actually, okay, but who can start to prevent this? Because actually this, if we're starting to see the health implications, the environmental implications, and the fact that they're just building and building and building in the environment, then how we sort of help that, I think, is so important. And of course, we can all do a little bit. And I love what you were saying, Lisa, about, washing on full loads and using cold and delicate cycles. And of course, like, that's really important, but their onus has to be elsewhere.
I agree.
Yeah, I really...
Go ahead, Emmy.
Go ahead. No, I really like what you're saying, Emily. And I think, those kinds of voluntary actions, not just by the consumers, but also the firms who are willing to take the leadership in changing the way they manufacture, what they manufacture, is definitely a complementary approach to the regulatory approach of mandating things, right? And I think we've seen successes in other kinds of pollution reduction through those voluntary actions by large firms. And so I think that's definitely things that we can push. The other thing is, the consumers would want to recognize and get the right signal that they are purchasing products that are made through those more technologies that don't shed as much fiber. And so I'm thinking that, another complementary approach is some kind of eco label, maybe on our clothes, or maybe even on the washing machine, saying that, just to say that, this fiber that, or these clothes don't shed as much fiber, or this is, less than the 0.1% threshold that Shreyas was talking about. Make a label for that that's international, globally adopted, and change things from that aspect as well. Consumers deal with a lot of information when we make choices about our clothes or even washing machines. So make that decision easier by simplifying that information through labeling or other things. It might be also an idea.
And Emmy, what you're saying as well, I think things are becoming easier and easier for brands to do that. We're seeing in the EU, particularly, things like digital product passports coming through. I think there's a lot of stuff. I mean, there's been a huge amount of textile legislation in the EU, particularly over the last few years. And I think that there are a lot of, digital technologies that are coming to the fore that enable, that level of material information and care information to be very easily now kind of put into the products. And I know there's a lot of work gathering that data and being able to have it for your product, but I think there's really exciting developments that enable some of that better information.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I love that we're getting into kind of like this consumer layer of it, like whose responsibility is it? Like, where does like the cost land as far as like who's going to be impacted by these changes that we need to put into action in some way? I'm curious, we were talking a little bit about washing machine filters or filtration options, like what is the cost impact of adding a filter to a washing machine, and who should be responsible for that higher expense, if so?
I could start, and then maybe I'll pass it over to Emily, because we did research on external filters. So something you would add on to a washing machine. It filters out the microfibers. Whenever you do a load of laundry, you clean them out, you throw it into the trash. These external filters, they can be quite expensive. When we installed them in about 100 people's homes, the filter units were around $200 US per unit, and we paid for a plumber to install it. There are these filters called the Filtrol 160. They're about the size of a paper towel roll, and it gets installed on the wall. So it's expensive to install it, and it's not a price point that everyone can afford. It's also a challenge when you have something that's that large and not integrated into the machine. There might not be space. So we, in our study where we were recruiting volunteers, there were a lot of people who wanted a filter, but just couldn't because they didn't have the space, or it wasn't accessible. Somebody couldn't reach behind their machine where the filter needed to go, or they had all the piping behind a drywall and they couldn't rip that up and install a filter. There just wasn't space. So we turned around about 1 in 4 people who wanted a filter, but then couldn't install one. So we really looked at this and said, you know, it needs to be cheaper. It could potentially be cheaper if it was just integrated automatically into the machines and was part of the washing machine company's manufacturing process. And, you know, at the time, several years ago, there weren't a lot of options. Like since then, more companies have come on and released other products. So we're seeing that competition as well. That's helping bring the price down. And it could make sense to just have these filters automatically built in. I'll nod to Emily now too, because they're in that space as well of making a product that is user friendly and just built in.
Yeah. So I think there are a number of aspects. So as Lisa says, you know, the cost of external filters and the size of them and how you place them are definitely all limitations. And again, for me, that's also where you see the onus on the consumer to make that additional purchase. So I'm, you know, I've already got a washing machine and now I'm having to buy this thing as well. I think what's really interesting within this, if you think about the context of cost, there's a couple of things. So an external filter is going to be more expensive. It requires more elements than an internal filter. You've got to enclose it and house it. There's more materials used. You've got to be able to, you know, have electrics to plug it in, all of that kind of stuff. So we know that when we can integrate a filter, that can be actually very cost effective at scale. I think one of the challenges for the laundry companies, the washing machine manufacturers, is how they then integrate that into their production line and into their platform, because there's obviously costs associated there as well. So, you know, it's not as straightforward as that. And there are definitely challenges for the manufacturer around that integration. But it's absolutely, from a consumer perspective, could bring the cost right down. I think the way that I like to think about it is that it's about kind of giving choice as well. And, you know, the being able to, you know, as Emmy was talking to you earlier as well, you know, this concept of actually it's going to take quite a long time for all machines. You know, generally washing machines have a lifetime of around 10 years. So that extension of time. So I think what we would love to see is that regulation and legislation coming through for integrated, so that we can start that process. As Lisa said, there are lots of technology companies out there. This isn't a monopoly. We're not the only one. There are a number of filtration providers. So there's absolutely that competitive space. And then I think that the external filter is still a really valuable additional product, because it then enables us to also look at those machines that we don't want to change over yet and still deal with that. And some of those things Lisa was talking about, you know, we've tried to be really mindful of when we've engineered a solution so that it can work at different heights. It doesn't need to sit above the waterline, you know, so that there are things that make it more consumer friendly. I think the one point I'd just really like to add, there was a really interesting study that was done, I think it was by the EU last year, and it was looking at the cost of microplastics. So it wasn't looking at fibers specifically, but it was looking at the cleanup cost of plastic versus microplastic. And I think it was something like 11 times more expensive to try and deal with microplastics than it is to deal with plastics. And so when we talk about cost, often what we talk about is, you know, that integration cost into the machine or that cost to the consumer. But what we're not thinking about is actually what's the total cost, that is the impact there, you know, because we often don't look at that sort of afterlife cost, if you like, of dealing with an issue once it's in the environment. And I really think that if we started to look at the cost of materials under that lens, you know, we see why do we see polyester being so prolific in fashion? It's because it's cheap. That is why it's so prolific, right? Now, if polyester or other plastic materials were costed according to that overall kind of impact and lifetime cost, would they suddenly have a different value than they have currently? And might that be a different way to think about it? And I just think that's really important to consider, because sometimes we look at just one very small aspect of it without taking into context that bigger picture.
I have Emmy's voice of negative externalities just like ringing.
I know, I was like, I want to hear what Emmy has to say about this based on all of your, consumer survey research as well.
Yeah, I think that on one hand, it might be easier to take the onus away from the consumers, but I also feel that, it's something that consumers actually should be paying for, if we were to correct for this negative externality, right? It's the cheap cost of consuming plastic materials doesn't take into account of the cost it imposes on the environment, right? So we're paying it. The price doesn't really include the social cost of pollution, which is really the problem. So I think that there needs to be some kind of a way to change behavior on the consumers as well, and not just relying on the manufacturers. And one way we could do is to try to measure how much people are willing to pay for these different alternative fibers, or even willingness to pay for installing these kinds of external filters, right? One kind of study that we're trying to do is to try to measure that people's willingness to pay to take actions to reduce pollution, microfiber pollution. And there are ways to do survey kind of approach to measure willingness to pay. So I think that kind of information is also helpful in understanding future behavioral change.
Mm-hmm.
And we have just seen really excitingly, or I find it very exciting, France moving towards looking at a tax, so if that's the right word to describe it, on, kind of cheap fashion. And I think that is a really exciting development. I know it's got a long way to go, but I think exactly as you're saying, Emmy, this idea of there being some level of additional cost there for that responsibility is so fundamental.
Yeah, because we're not paying the full cost of fast fashion for microfibers or these other environmental issues as well. And we didn't touch on it yet, but a lot of research points to fast fashion, poorly constructed garments as being major contributors of microfibers, because there's more shedding on new garments in general. We see kind of a tail, it sort of levels off after several washes. And also, if you have, many people are probably familiar with seeing poorly constructed hems, and when you have materials that aren't well made, the fabrics are looser, or the edges are not perfectly hemmed, and you have a lot of fiber shedding along those hems, and by materials kind of breaking up and not lasting. So it's great to see some action specifically on fast fashion, because the volumes are just staggering.
Yeah, and it keeps increasing. Every new company out there wants to one up the next and become the ultra fast fashion brand now. So it's frighteningly fast and frighteningly excessive.
We used to have 4 fashion seasons: spring, summer, fall, and winter, and then early spring, mid-spring, late spring, and now it's not even seasons. It's just constant.
Micro trend after micro trend.
Micro trends. Oh.
Even the behavioral stuff is, it's so fascinating in terms of how they operate. I mean, literally just last night, my niece, who is only 14, she texts me and she's like, will you sign up for this company? Because if you sign up, then I'm going to get a discount on something. And I'm like, no, because I'm going to give you a lecture instead about why you shouldn't be buying from here. But, she's 14. They're gamifying purchasing, because that's how, you know, digital first alpha generation are behaving, you know, and they're tapping into this behavioral stuff to encourage this consumption. And, you know, that being allowed is, I think, so wrong, and something really needs to happen about that. But anyway, that's a whole other webinar probably.
I know. I feel like there's so many other layers that we can touch on here, and we're getting near the end. So before we quickly jump to the Q&A, I'm wondering if each of you can just share a brief thought of what practical step you think we can do at home right now if we want to get involved to try to reduce microfiber pollution. Anybody
first?
I could go. I have started washing less, and I haven't become smellier. I hang dry my jeans and let it air out. And some denim companies say never wash your jeans, and they become very fit to you and personalized. You can hang it outside. You can put it in the freezer. That's one thing that I've really started doing. It's gonna make my garments last longer, and I have to do less laundry. That's mine.
So I would say that alongside those kind of washing habits, as Lisa said earlier, we know that new garments shed a lot more. So, you know, if you're shopping, maybe, you know, wear your wardrobe first. You don't need to shop, but if you do need to shop, you know, maybe look for secondhand, because we know that you're going to see benefits there. And there are some great things you can do with apps now that will help you if you're searching for something specific. They might show it to you secondhand, stuff like that. So I would say that.
Yeah, I was also going to say secondhand, but another idea, you know, Amazon or other online stores already have readily available these balls that you can use when you wash, that would take a much lower proportion, but some of the microfiber out. So maybe that's one thing people can try.
Mm-hmm.
I think my answer has been stolen already with buying secondhand, because I think this blazer is a thrift store blazer. I think it's kind of it's an antique. I just happened to find it for $20. But I usually I try to avoid buying new clothes as much as possible. I got married last year, so I did buy myself a new suit. But other than that, I try to not buy it to the extent I can.
Mm-hmm. Love it. Yeah. Also wearing all of my vintage secondhand. Yes. That's, I think, a really good tip we can keep in mind. All right. Well, we only have so many minutes left. So let's jump over to the Q&A and see what we have here. All right. So Sonia says, do you know of an initiative that is working on a nomenclature for synthetic materials? Very often we see words such as polyester, polyurethane, spandex, etc., but we don't really know whether they are equivalent. This will be useful when studying microfibers pollution.
Yeah, there's a lot of work that's going into definitions right now. Like, what is a microfiber? A lot of the definitions point to microfibers being plastic, but also these modified, man-made cellulosics and natural fibers as well. What I think is maybe missing from the conversation is nylon, polyester. Many folks that are in the know that's plastic, but I think to the general consumer, some of these materials, we don't always make the link that they are plastic. So a lot of jurisdictions around the world, different countries that are working on microfiber pollution are trying to define it. And a lot of the definitions I've seen are pretty encompassing of lots of different material types.
One quick shout out here is if folks are following the negotiations for the Global Plastics Treaty, the latest version is supposed to happen in Ottawa, Canada this month. But there's a huge asterisk here. If things go as far as, you know, activists and those of us hoping do, one of the outcomes of this treaty would be that there would be like a United Nations standard on what counts as plastics, and there would be like a globally recognized labeling system. So you can't just make up a new term that it's a natural polyester or whatever. Like it has to be like in a certain bucket. That would, I think, would go a long way.
Mm-hmm. All right, thank you. James says there's a fundamental lack of understanding wastewater treatment and what materials are passed through into bodies of water. Shreyas, did you have some thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's we don't quite have enough time to really get into it, but I'll just flag that this is a really important topic that we didn't quite touch on, and like the having this last line of defense that we should do everything we can on the front end, like, you know, from the manufacturing and purchasing and washing side of things, but kind of the last line of defense, as I see it, before our pollution enters the environment, is municipal and regional wastewater treatment facilities. And there's quite a lot of engineering and innovation happening there to stop microfibers and other contaminants. But one has to remember that we should do that, and it's a good point to address, but it's very, very resource intensive. So I live in a wealthy part of the world, and our municipality still, like, they're wealthy, but they still struggle with like raising billions of dollars to make these infrastructure upgrades. So let alone like other parts of the world where they don't have that kind of tax revenue to justify these massive investments. So it's really important. And there's like other infrastructure measures like quote unquote stormwater infrastructure or rainwater, as they call it. And that needs to be pushed, but it's like this stuff is expensive.
And it's also then what they do, isn't it? Because, you know, we see, I mean, not just in the UK, in other parts of the world, you know, they will capture those fibers, but they'll be in the sludge, and then they'll spread that sludge on the land. And then the rainwater, you know, they will travel, as we know, and they get back into the water and back into the system. So I think it's that holistic piece again, isn't it, Shreyas, that if you're going to have these solutions, you can't then reverse them by, you know, an additional activity. And there's been loads of press, and it's very UK specific, around sewage spills and this just this seismic piece around them at the moment in the UK, where we're seeing old infrastructure, and we're seeing, you know, actually it's cheaper for them to just do that than actually deal with it. So, you know, I think it's all of that combined, isn't it, around, you know, that actually, like you say, is very much a last line of defense as opposed to an early one.
Oh, I wish we had more time because there's just so many more layers to it, but I feel like you've all really brought so many layers to the table. One thing that maybe we can leave folks with is if you can think of like one word that is kind of like your focus to address microfiber pollution, like what are you thinking about right now?
Collaboration.
Regulation.
Incentives.
I guess I'll take innovation.
Great.
Love all of those.
Love it. We have 2 minutes, so there is one more question that came in. Let's try to see if we can give a glimpse of it. Peter says there's a huge knowledge gap for consumers with regard to their clothes, which could be filled by more informative labels. Perhaps brands could develop a final garment with much less processing, chemical load, where the microfibers more readily biodegrade in the environment, more undergarments undyed, ?
Yeah, I mean, we have ingredient lists for our food with additives. Maybe we can have that for our clothing to increase transparency on what's actually going into our clothing, because we know from the research that just like food, these microfibers are getting into us. So they're getting into our bodies, and we should know what's in them.
And part of that is, like I mentioned, a little more upstream of like, it's not even the apparel manufacturers, it's upstream of like the brands don't know what's going into their clothes. Like it's the one level up, the people who make the polymers themselves are keeping this information proprietary.
I think that keeping the information also simple for consumers to digest is really important. You know, if we look at a long list of ingredients in food, you know, it's gonna take a lot of time for people to process the information. So I think the labeling is also a good approach.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, Thank you all so much for joining. I hope you leave this conversation with a little bit of hope and optimism, and realizing that folks like these here are really working diligently to try to provide more access to more solutions. If you're interested to learn more, you can also get involved on an individual level by taking 5 Gyres Pledge to do less for the planet, and you'll get access to resources, workshops, and more. But thank you all so much. Thank you to all of our experts and doctors and innovators here who have shared so much wisdom with us.